Hello, everybody. So I'm Enrique Fuenteblanca, and I'm gonna try to be, again, like short. It's a pleasure to have you here again and hold new faces also. So we are gonna keep like this program just with this conversation between Tsang and Sophia Al-Maria. They were working together for all this program that we likely have here. They were working during the research process of the Carmen ongoing project that we is developing, but actually it's an extension or ongoing of a long collaboration that started like a lot of years ago. So I think that is an opportunity to have here, because as Beatrix from Hartwig said yesterday, Carmen is one of these topics when you think that you already know it, or you have this feeling that you already know it, but at the same time, when you try to do a kind of microscopical approach, you realize that there is a lot of layers and multiplicities of possible approaches. So I think that it's an opportunity to understand like how was the process of creation. They were collaborating together for the script of the live opera that was presented here in June, I think. Also for the whole extended process of conceiving this approach, theoretical and practical, to Carmen. So I think that it could be nice to start talking a little about what were you doing actually, and what was this opera, this script, this process, and this film. And I will try to help if something happens, but actually I think that it won't be like really needed. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for the people for making it possible, and for all the institutions that are here with us. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Yeah, I just wanted to add a few thanks again to Balie and to Hartwig Foundation, because there is a film that's installed and presented next door, and there's also the opera Carmen that Sophia and I worked on that was in the Holland Festival this summer. But somehow for me, these projects are part of a larger process, and it's really exciting for us to be here in Balie at this moment, continuing to reflect on this material. I think like the space of discussion and like study and sharing of resources and collaboration, these are all things that are actually at the core of the project. And so there are these kind of end products that the public sees, but actually for me, the most important thing is actually all of the discussion and the process that happens behind the scenes. And so it's really exciting for me to sit with both of you, Enrique, who's a really important collaborator in this process, because Carmen was like many, many years in the making. The opera adaptation that we did, that we presented here this summer, it was something that started like, I guess, 8 years ago, but it was many years of building to this point. And somewhere in that process, I'd say 2 years ago, the research brought me to Sevilla, where I met Enrique and Pedro and Pastora, who gave us talk earlier. And Sophia actually came with me on that first research trip, and then we also returned together. So it's been like an ongoing exchange that it doesn't for me feel like we're wrapping up something or reflecting on something that's finished. It's actually, we're still very invested in this material, and it's exciting to talk about it now. So, yeah.
It's extremely exciting to talk with you about it publicly, because our part of the process is often one that isn't seen. We've worked on many projects together now. Moby Dick, Pinocchio, Tempest, Carmen, and we're doing Robin Hood now for the Schauspielhaus in Zurich, which I'm very excited about. Love doing a kids' play, but Carmen is a very adult story. And one of the things that I find really special about collaborating in general, but especially in working with you, Wu, is that we can make one thing together, but have totally different perspectives on what it is or what it's saying. And this is across the board with any collaboration. And so I had a question for you, which is, first of all, what does the relationship between Carmen and Don Jose represent for you? Because I have very specific ideas about what it means for me. But I'm curious to know your side and your perspective of that relationship, that toxic love affair.
Yeah. Wow. Actually, yeah. I know you asked me this. You told me this was a question that you would ask.
I can talk a little bit if you want me to.
No. I feel like I even in knowing that you would ask me in this moment, I feel it's a difficult one to answer because it's not for me like the center of the project somehow. Like meaning, there's a love story, but for me, the love story or the love-hate story of Carmen and Don Jose is like kind of. It's part of like what brings the audience, everyone loves like a dramatic love drama, so it's kind of there almost like a skeleton or like a tool. People always get hooked on drama, so I guess I didn't invest too much in their relationship, but I do, of course, think there are like these kind of tropes that he represents or that she represents, and we are always in our work like playing with the expectations and the stereotypes. So like this relationship of Carmen and Don Jose is like one in which she is representing some kind of radical freedom and he desires to possess that. And that is something that she would rather die than kind of give in to that. So I think that's like a theme that we work with. But yeah, tell me what it means for you, because maybe there is something else.
Well, essentially the same, but for me, it felt like a one-to-one example of fascism and the revolutionary feeling, and we tried to bring some of that in through the extra layer we added to the opera with a character named Miriam, who, I don't know if you want to talk about Miriam, or I can tell a bit of the backstory. But essentially, Wu was very strongly insistent from the beginning about what the sources were. So we were going to work with the Bizet libretto. We were going to also include the Mérimée novella, which Bizet based the opera on. And there's a character in the beginning of the book which sort of, it isn't...
Mérimées book.
Yeah, of Mérimées book, which is an archaeologist. And this archaeologist is a sort of foil for Mérimée himself. He also did archaeology and I don't know if he was a practicing archaeologist, but he was responsible for finding various Roman sites, I think, and other things. Maybe you know the specifics. But we wrote a character called Miriam, who is a student at University of Sevilla, looking for a grave from the Spanish Civil War, and specifically looking for a person who she doesn't know if she's real or not, but was a singer who sang for the anti-fascists. And in the book, the archaeologist is looking for another military site, so that felt like a sort of appropriate direction to take it in. But it's 3 layers on top of each other inside of the opera, and that was a truly wild experience to weave together narratively.
Yeah, I guess I would just add there are sort of 3 facets maybe of our adaptation that are helpful to kind of share for those of you that didn't see it, is that we decided that there's a contemporary layer that's set in Sevilla. So there's a lot of like interplay around Sevilla in the present, and also like the idea of the fantasy of Carmen. Because the first time that Sophia and I visited Sevilla, one of the first things that actually happened was that we were taken on a tour, a Carmen tour of the city. And it was really lovely and sort of irreverent, because the tour guide was like, here's where Carmen and Don Jose fought, and like here's Lilas Pastia's bar, and like these are not actual places, but it was like the investment in that fantasy was so real. I had to sort of ask, like, but you're not actually serious, right? Because this is not a real thing that happened. And he was like, yeah, but we think this is where it would have happened because it matches the description in the book. So I kind of got obsessed about this investment in reproducing the fantasy and the history. And so there's one layer that's our archaeologist is kind of in this present layer. So in some sense, I think she's kind of like a foil for maybe our perspective, like our excavation. And then there's also an aspect where we revived the original Bizet form, because actually after Bizet died, they turned his sort of like spoken dialogue scenes into recitatives, because I think that's like the more modern accepted form of opera is like the whole thing has to be sung. But actually the original Carmen was like an opera comique, so it was more like an operetta. Like it was really more like a hybrid theater, play acting, comedy, stage piece with music. And so we went back to that source material, and we found a lot of really good stuff. Also had to edit a lot, but I think that, so that was sort of how we found a way to make like a hybrid kind of theater opera piece. And then the third thing was that we decided to have 3 Carmens, which I think you could say a lot more about that. But were you about to say something? Yeah.
More Mary May, please.
No, I just wanted to try to do also like a connection with the talk that we were having before in some way, because we were talking about something that is so important in the opera, that is this comic aspect, that is it has a lot of strength. And one of the theses that we were discussing when we were researching on this topic is that Carmen is too many things at the same time. It's like it's the embodiment of a lot of ways of subalternities. This is the word that we kind of chosen for talking about that. But it's a presence of coloniality in the narrative of Carmen. It's a presence of the working class fights as a kind of cigarette maker in the factory. But at the same time, it has a lot to things to do with like her like condition of lumpen, condition of way of life, and at the same time she was like in this like gap between of the symbolic projection of Orientalism that was trying to put everything together, and in some way all these different ideas were crashing and were impossible to stage in some way. In some way the only answer was like killing her in the script. So, for example, I think in the Godard film, when he tries to create a subject interested in political emancipation with Carmen, and he thinks that for doing that, he needs to sacrifice all these other identities of Carmen that were like so important. Probably Pastora would have a lot of things to say about that, like about what he chose to sacrifice. And in some way, there was one question before that was like so interesting about like the parody as a way of resistance. Yeah. So in some way, I feel that the way of creating all these leaders was a really acting of taking the language, taking like all these ideas about identities and turn them out in a really radical sense. So I don't know if I kind of got this meaning, or what do you think?
I think that that's an extremely astute link, because this parodic conversation, the conversation about parody that was being had earlier, if you weren't here, was specifically around it as a mode of resistance with Gitano people. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that was what I understood of it. It was in Spanish. But in many ways, I feel like the Miriam character that we added on top was in a way like thumbing our nose at opera as an institution also, to just put in the middle of it this sort of absurd character who is also battling an institution inside of the script. So she's fighting with her professor who doesn't want her to dig up this gravesite. It's an unfinished project in a lot of ways, even within it, so it becomes very meta. It's actually, now that I think about it, a little bit adaptation. Like, which I don't know why I didn't think of that before, but it really feels like she's so absurd, and she had to be absurd in many ways alongside opera singers, because there's an actor and then you have these, incredible professional singers and dancers, and all of this is going on, and there's just this little academic played by Pearl Palom, who's incredible. And stomping around, talking to herself, smoking, complaining, and going in circles. It's sort of like that, the image that always comes to mind is that meme of somebody who's gone a bit mad and is trying to explain something on a wall with like red string running everywhere. And to attempt to unpack the unexplainable. And so I think that there is a parodic, we brought that parody in through Miriam, at least in my eyes. And it's interesting also seeing how audiences respond to words that were written differently depending on the night. The first night, it was very much buoyant, but then from what I understand, other times there was less laughter in the room around some of the things that were written in as little pokes at the dominant structure of the narrative. Did Carmen have to die? That's my question, because you mentioned that. I had thoughts about it. We had it very early on in our discussions around what would happen in this version, kind of disagreement. I came around to your side of understanding it. But that question of the sacrificial lamb is an important one. I'd love to hear what both of you have to say about that. Why must Carmen die? Viva la Carmen!
Well, another voice that's not in the room, but that I would bring into the room is Fred Moten, because he's also another collaborator along with Pedro here, where we had many discussions and thinking, and like there's like this, one of his notes was like, every time she dies, she comes back differently. And that's like in the film that we sort of made like a kind of loop, a sort of like performative death loop or something with the film. And I guess in the opera, I was also thinking about going beyond the death, like not that the death is the ending. So for example, I think your contribution in the text that you wrote for the afterlife of Carmen, I think is for me like one of the most important aspects of the adaptation. But I think like that's maybe just one of the sensibilities that I have as a maker, is like, I like to stick to the plot because I somehow feel like the plot contains everything that you need, like even if it's wrong, that if you follow it, you can go beyond it, which is I think a similar strategy we had we did an adaptation of Moby Dick together, and we kept the storyline the same. So everybody, sorry, this is a spoiler, but everybody drowns except for Ishmael, the narrator. But we decided to like go with Pip into the cosmos at the bottom of the sea, and we discover that actually Pip is alive and living in the spirit of the sub librarian. So I think there's like ways to deal with death, or even just deal with like a plot that's problematic, that there we have kind of all the tools we need as makers to kind of trouble them.
The
so
waters.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't feel like we needed to change it, but I don't know. Do you think she needs to die?
Poor Carmen. I was about to bring here also Fred's words in some way, also because other of the sentence that he wrote is like we shouldn't leave her alone in some way, because in some way like this is what we did in the construction of Carmen, but also because I have this feeling that because of this relationship between different identities that are impossible to put together, there is something about like the ungraspability of Carmen. I think that this is also one of the main ideas that we were discussing together. And one of the things that I learned in the process is when you are not able to answer about what it is, at least you can question yourself how it works. And in this idea of like questioning how it works, I think that the idea of death in Carmen is some of the answers of how the myth works, how it develops, or how it's like all the time happening again. So the question about if she must die, it's a really serious question, in the sense that if for example, as Pastora was explaining before, it is understand as a kind of like a guide about like how should be a correct behavior. And there is a kind of impossibility of doing a reparative lecture, because it's going to be keep on working and it's going to be reproducing violence and this brutal identity of how to manage control and how to produce subjectivity. So I think that I have an open question more than an answer.
You're the tiebreaker. I mean, my perspective has consistently been that Carmen dying over and over and over again is like we talked about, this sort of creation of the universe thing, and that goes back to like even the ritual of killing a bull in the Mithraic mystery cults. A bull, the lore is that a bull is killed and the universe is created. And that was the only way that I could finally get my head around it, was that would open up and allow this extra sort of epilogue with the character with the Miriam character. Because deep in my heart, I don't want what Carmen represents for me being a sort of revolutionary, Thelonic, like ungraspable freedom to die. And that would be like a hopeless thing to continue that. But I also understand the sacrificial sort of martyrdom of Carmen to the European male, like that crystallized rage that happens when you can't have something. And that's something that happens with, we talked also earlier in the previous talk about the way that, for example, like a veiled woman also crystallizes that frustration and urge towards violence. And it's because the unknowable is very vexing to the empirical mind. And yeah, so I still think that there is a timeline where Carmen doesn't die.
We just haven't reached that part of the multiverse yet.
Yeah. We're on the wrong timeline. The dark timeline.
Maybe there is a question here for you, because there is something that if you see the video installation that is in the next room, you can appreciate that there is an image that is, for me, like really, really interesting, because it's an image of bullfighting, but from the point of view of the bull. So the camera was actually like physically in some way, like moving on the head of the bull. And in some way, to talk about this out of field or out of frame, about this impossibility to speak, has a lot of things to do with this kind of condition of being killed. If in some way Carmen emancipated and get the microphone in some way and get the speaker, lost her condition. In some ways, this kind of like speak-back question about like the possibility of a speak of subalternity in some way. But I think that there is a kind of reparative movement in setting in taking the point of view of the animal when we are talking about like sacrificing, because this is what is never done, taking this space of the outer frame. I don't know how you feel like after talking about the process and about like everything, all the questions that it brought. How do you feel good about like this animality that is also present, for example, in the film, but it's emerged in some way also in the opera, in some characters?
I mean, I guess it would probably be like an ongoing theme, or like, yeah, like there, I can think of multiple works, where, like even in Moby Dick, where for us, like the whale and the perspective of the whale, or this idea of like telling the story from below the water, this kind of approach is like very informed. Yeah, like there's so many like, I'm just thinking of like Black feminist eco practice. Like there's so many like traditions of this like way of working. So I'm just like an inheritant of these traditions. But I think like, I don't know, yeah, I think that was really important that was just maybe one reason that I would like argue with Sophia, like she must die or something, is I just didn't want to like resuscitate her as an individual character. I just felt like
I agree with you there.
For sure. I know you do, actually. Yeah, so.
I was just imagining you having to intervene because we have a fight like the girls in the tabacaria. When you were like, I'll be here in case anything goes wrong. But I'm trying to think if we've had like other, because I know that like in the closed room of a writing room or when people are collaborating, there are definitely a lot of like ideological battles or like plot conundrums and things that have to get hashed out. I think the Carmen Must Die one versus Carmen Mustn't came to mind, but I'm wondering if there are any other sort of forks that we passed through that are maybe interesting to share. Because there was this in particular, because it was, for me anyway, like having simultaneously the opera layer and the book layer, and then the new fiction on top. It really felt like weaving a very complicated tapestry. Mm-hmm. And I needed your guidance constantly in terms of where to drive it. The tabacaria scene, pretty fab.
I have another question.
Save the day.
That is like, there is like something important about like the languages and jargons in Mary Mess works. In the end of the novel, there is a kind of epilogue about like how all these jargons used to work in some way. And when you were doing like the opera, there was like a huge things about languages also, because you did the opera in how it was. I mean, like this.
There was the French,
German. You are not German speakers in some way.
I'm not a speaker of nothing, barely even English, but. The language conundrum is one that we've consistently had with our various adaptations of classics. They always have to end up in Swiss German in the context of where they're beginning at the Schauspielhaus. But this was different because also so much of the source material that we were watching, like La Chaudron, that was just on, that film doesn't have words in it and it's many different languages, but just the intake of of all these different sources can be quite befuddling. We had a color-coded script to see the different parts that needed translation, that didn't need translation, because the French had to stay in French because it would be sung in French, is that right? And then there was an English play, and then there's also the things that all of the crew had to be able to read, etc. I mean, it gets very technical.
I mean, I also think somehow there's just an inherent problem of language with this opera because it's set in Sevilla, but the opera's written in French. So there was just already like, well, what would make sense? I mean, it's not like to speak Spanish would be the more authentic version. Mm-hmm. It's already a projection. So we just, in some ways, felt a bit of liberty to just be provisional with the language. Like, if we did it again in another place with a different cast, maybe the language would keep changing.
I like that porousness because it feels important with this kind of project for sure.
But actually, there was a text that got sort of omitted. But there's a scene at the end when Miriam finally meets Carmen, and she says like, "Who are you?" And Carmen has this little like, "I'm this person." She kind of lists all these things that she is, and we tried it in like 7 languages. It was like French, German, Basque, like Arabic. We tried it that way, but actually it just didn't land. So I think there's always like that attempt to like that because this is in my mind there's 12 Carmens, at least 12 Carmens, and there's like at least 12 languages, but that's sort of not really how we might experience a play in a way that we can hold on to like the story, the drama, the emotions of what we're experiencing. So somehow you make like you cut corners or you get more pragmatic about it, but
Also, that's a resistance that I think Carmen would make, like just not say anything, because language is a trap. Especially the ways that even talking about Carmen, it's like it's trapping something, it's trapping a feeling, a person. I feel trapped by language all the damn time. It's a very frustrating thing to have be my actual job. But it's
Maybe
useful.
Could you talk also a little bit more? I did want to mention a little bit more about our choice to screen La Chaudrome, because it's a film that, for us, when we were working on our research, was very inspirational. And I think what drew me to it was like the idea of understanding flamenco like as part of a continuum, and like the musical styles, how they travel. And I guess I think you also similarly, maybe it spoke to you in that way from your own, how you come to flamenco or how you come to this kind of subject matter.
Well, the exciting thing about La Chaudrome is that it's a time travel piece. So it begins in Punjab and ends up in Spain, and it's the sort of story of, which some of you I'm sure have seen it in here, but this story of the Roma people's diaspora and movement into Europe. But it sort of feels, even though it's all shot at the same time, it feels like you start in some sort of the year 1000 place and then slowly progress into modernity. And that's something that I work in historical fiction a lot, writing, and to see something that's so elegantly described with no words, but only music, people's history was incredibly inspiring, and it's something that I don't think like a play could ever do, or even a book. And again, like to name something is to sort of entrap it, but to witness is very different, and I think that witnessing in the film, that as the viewer, like you really do feel like you are witnessing some kind of evolution and movement. So that's what I'm always sort of like yearning towards when I'm writing about the past, or like even we weren't quite sure whether we should keep it all in one time period, for example, in the opera. This often comes up with the various things that we're working on. Is it contemporary? Is it not contemporary? Is it, do we stick, like in Moby Dick, there's a scene where there's a oil flare on the ocean, and that's just one
oil rig.
Yeah, like an oil rig that has a gas flare, and that sort of temporal remixing, I guess, and including things that from our contemporary experience in some cases ancient, some cases 19th century stories, feels really important as a part of like a base layer of the things that we've been doing. And I think it runs across all of them. Similarly in The Tempest, I mean, that was another very clear, I think, example of that. But just to speak to what you were saying about Orientalism, I was thinking while saying that there's something else that happens when you're writing about the past or doing a speculation. It is also fantasy, so in a lot of ways I feel like there's a danger when rewriting history or revising history of being whatever the equivalent of Orientalist would be on a temporal layer, where you can just project things and assume things and want to know things that you cannot know. And that is something that I'm always really hyper aware of and try to tread lightly around. It's like not what was probable, but what was possible that is like the sort of key to telling timeless stories alongside something like as canonical as Bizet and Mérimée, as much as we'd like to thumb our noses at that institution.
Yes. if you talk about like this trip that is like really well represented in La Chaudrome in some way of like how you could do like the concert trip, just watching how that the different state nations are taking these representations and exploring them symbolically and integrating in some way of the different national identities. And this is something that happens with Carmen all the time, actually. In every country, there is a kind of like appropriation about like what Carmen is and how it represents like their own like nationality. And you were working in a kind of like international based mood in some way, but you needed to present that in Switzerland at the very first time, and then you move it, and I don't know, how did you feel like this kind of weird feeling of doing a Carmen, also with this double projection about like the myth of Seville, but not being from Seville, that is like something stupid, but how do you feel like when you approach it that maybe like, I don't know.
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, how do you feel? Because I guess you came to Sevilla with me 2 times, and then I've spent quite a lot of time there at this point. But yeah, I think I'm still trying to make sense of it as a place that it's like in my mind it's some kind of source for Carmen, or it's even like a source for a lot of operas actually are set in Seville, and this is like interesting somehow. Like, why is this place? Why is this city the location of all these different, totally different kinds of stories? And I think it says something about like a borderland of Europe or something. Like it's a place that's not actually Europe, you know, at least as I experience it. I don't know if you would agree, but I think that was part of our exploration, was like thinking about the history, the architecture, and kind of, yeah.
One of the very useful things is like when you go, because on that first trip, we went to the colonial archives, for example. That was wild. To understand more about the tobacco trade, but then at the same time learning about the other side of the river. What's the name of the? Triana. Yeah, Triana. The way that was, you know, from Andalusian time, like an absolute like mixing place where people from all over Africa, all over West Asia, you know, it's a port. The river brings people in, but the othered, the maligned, the lumpen proletariat, whatever you want to say, like everybody is below the river. And then there's the Golden Tower across. And that sort of division is a perfect setup for drama. It's, you know, the fundamental thing you need is 2 tribes to have a feud, or to have a love affair, or to have, you know, any of these things. So that's what I feel probably is one reason among the many that Sevilla is a location for other operas, of which I can only think of one, but about someone who cuts hair. But other than that, yeah, it's incredibly rich. And actually, we had a lot of storylines drop off of our original plan. I don't know if would you share the original plan with the Miriam character, what she was excavating, and the bar?
Oh yeah, there was a whole other storyline that she was excavating a bathhouse, which was based on an actual bar in Sevilla, where they were like digging and they were renovating and they discovered that there was like a bathhouse, like, and yeah, so we went to this bar and sat thinking we would like write our story there. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, but I think
it's it's the layers of the different cultures also that had been through. And that's the exciting thing about places like that, because a church was once a mosque, was once maybe a temple, was once maybe, you know, you go back and peel the layers off. It's like a palimpsest, but architecturally. And that was also very much, I think, present in the narrative, is that like creating some kind of palimpsest that you could peel back, and having these sort of meta through lines running in between the stories. But that bathhouse was beautiful. Recommend going. Have a cerveza.
I think that also could be like so nice if you feel that you can interrupt and just like participate, feel so free, because the idea is that this is a kind of open dialogue, so it could be beautiful, and you can just like make questions, and we will like turn the microphone. Also, I think that in the way that I'm gonna keep on like asking things, there was like something like really beautiful in the way of like collaborating that was like open to the very end. That, for example, this dancer Javiera de la Fuente that went to participate in the opera, some kind of like last time's editions, but talks a lot about like how to keep open like all these questions and all these bodies on the stage in some way. So I don't know, how did you feel? If you want to share like something about the collaboration, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I probably shouldn't say this, like, but to me, it's not done. Like, I just keep feeling like there's more work to be done with Carmen. So, like, even the opera that we premiered in Zurich and then performed here in the Holland Festival, there kept being huge changes. For example, like, yeah, like we lost a dancer the week before the premiere, so one of the flamenco dancers from Sevilla joined our company, and then when we were in Holland, our Don Jose lost his voice, so he couldn't sing. And we had a Dutch tenor standing on the edge of the stage with like a music stand. And actually, for some reason, that might not have been fully communicated. So the audience actually just thought that that was part of our staging. So I guess these kind of provisional things about the piece, like I almost felt like we never had our whole cast even. Somehow we kept having different people a part of it. Like the first time Javiera performed with us, it was actually a situation of a cast emergency. We lost someone. Javiera came to Zurich. She sat in the audience in her costume and watched the first act because she hadn't seen it yet, and then took off her jacket and got into the second act because literally that was how like fluid the piece was. And she totally did an amazing job. So I guess I'm just saying these are little like anecdotes about the show must go on. But actually, I think in a way, like if we're able to continue to make theater in this provisional way where it keeps evolving, I would be so excited, because I don't know, I'm thinking again of a little bit of a phrase of Fred's where he was talking like, Carmen, we can't leave Carmen alone, and Carmen won't leave us alone. Like it's like we keep working. She won't let us leave her alone. You know, we have to keep revising or something. So
we'll be haunted until we actually follow her the whole way. Infinite revisions. Any infinite questions?
In some ways, it's a very first question that is like, why Carmen today, in some ways? If you can keep...
I mean, I think it's more important than ever to unpack these things, but with a critical eye in the context of when and how that story was written in the first place. And a actual question around the colonial attitude, the male gaze that it came with, the proprietary nature even of the story, and the way that Carmen is used as a nationalist sort of symbol. Also, like, you know, every tourist shop sort of, you know, stamped with Carmen memorabilia. And all of those things are really important questions now, as they always already have been. But it feels quite urgent. Let's do it again, but different.
Maybe you could also say a little bit about the text that you wrote for Carmen's afterlife, because I do think that that's like one kind of, I mean, besides that we had this like contemporary layer that was like interweaving of the story, the afterlife after Carmen is murdered by Don Jose, there's kind of this other, there's this like sort of coda to the piece, and you wrote this beautiful text. I don't know if you care to share a bit about it, because it does feel like to me that's the part where the play kind of breaks into a more contemporary or more open idea of the present or something.
Well, I suppose that part, which I wish I could recite for you, but I don't have it memorized.
I could almost do it.
Yeah, you could probably. It might help, but I can say
it's kind of inspired by Attell, maybe. Would you say, or?
Yeah. So it's in the mode of, I forget the grammatical term now.
Infinitive.
In the infinitive. So it's a repetition of various experiences.
To be
so like
dead,
to be dead.
To be born.
Yeah.
To grow old. That, yeah, it goes on.
Etc. To be sitting in a room on a carpet with Wu and Enrique and all of you. To be speaking. And the infinitive is a really powerful thing. It's from a text called To Be in a Time of War by Attell Adnan. That was what inspired that ending. And in that text, Attell is really exploring the dissonance between understanding like the sort of cosmic horror of war and being helpless. And so it's the sort of little quotidian day things that she's talking about in it most of the time. And I think with the very, very simple, short, infinitive piece at the end of it, it felt like it was like this sort of cosmic opening ending. It wasn't really an outro, but an intro in a lot of ways. And I guess an incantation to not being defeated, I suppose, in that way of like, in a way, maybe that was also
that was
my chance to like not have her actually die. To not have the hope of a different world die.
Actually, about why did you have her die? Of course, there's the opera trope in the fifth act. Always someone has to die, but you can. And I would like to have a connection made to the La Mentira over there, where you directly refer to full biting, biting. Add that too. Exactly, and the bull has to die. And in that formalization and aestheticization also of the relationship between culture and the wild, actually was very Carmen in a way. So I was wondering why, maybe she's haunting you, you have to not let her die as long. So why, particularly with what Sophia just said about that afterthought, why in the end did you decide not to break the opera rule in a way, which is much more than the opera rule, which is like a bigger societal
rule.
Yeah.
Pattern.
No, I'm not sure what else I could say. Do you have?
Maybe if we did do that and you had made a decision to let Carmen live, we wouldn't be able to continue thinking about it. Just saving it for later. Maybe subconsciously somewhere.
Thanks for the talk. Is it possible to speak a little more about why you wanted to keep the bizet quite intact through the adaptation, and like why that was important as a rule entering into the relationship with Sophia?
Actually, the bizet is about, I think it's about half of our music. So we worked with a composer, Andrew Yee, and she did a mixture of original score and recomposing. So she took motifs of the bizet and then wrote new music. So I don't know, because maybe I assume from your question you saw the opera. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, it's not all bizet. It's about. I think we used about half of the opera, and the other half we rewrote.
I think what it meant was like you can do a Carmen without any of the bizet, or like existing material, especially since you have interests in taking the material further or questioning the form. And so knowing that you've been working with the house for a while, and knowing the performers and ensemble, and developing an approach to theatre, I think I'm interested in like what of the original you like to keep and what you decide to put aside, and how that balances with what the audience expects from a work like Carmen.
Yeah, it's tricky. Thank you for your question. I think we did sort of choose where we felt like the Bizet worked. Like in some sense, I think there's like, I love the familiarity of it. It's like pop music, and that's in that sense like we have worked on other projects where we use and reuse like popular references. So in that sense, I think some melodies just felt like we have to do this because everyone's going to expect it. And I guess that's not actually true. Like you could also have the opposite logic where you say, if everyone expects it, then let's not do it. But I think we were sort of wanting to play with the like evoking that like popular, where the melody is like playing in your head, or you're like seeing something on stage, but you're also experiencing in your own head all the other versions that you know. Like it could just be like from a commercial, or from like, I don't know, a Formula One race, or like all the various ways that Bizet like lives in the popular consciousness. So that was something we intentionally wanted to do, which may be kind of like the part of me that's like really into like drag music, like drag performance, where it's kind of campy, or like we were sort of just like embracing the pop element of the piece. But I also, I don't know. Maybe we use too much. I don't know. I'm like ready to just keep going and try a different version, like without any Bizet. I don't know.
I want to see the spin-off.
There's a question here. Yes, I was wondering. So full disclosure, I did not see the opera, so I don't know. But what is the relationship between the opera that you already made and the film like next door? Is it a continuation of the same project? Is it different pieces that you want or different themes that you wanted to explore? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, they're very different, but they sort of, the creation process for both like started at the same time. I mentioned Sophia and I went to Sevilla together the first time, and like so the writing and the development of the script for our adaptation started around the same time that I met Enrique and I met Pedro and Pastora. And so then it basically became a process of like, how much can we take on in a live production? Like somehow I feel like, again, I keep saying it's not over, because I think like, I've seen so many Carmen adaptations where the flamenco is added in a really unthoughtful way. So I was like, we're not going to do that. Like, we're not going to try to force something we don't understand, but maybe the film could be a way to try to investigate in parallel. And Zurich, for me, was like the space of the fantasy. It was more like dealing with the critique of the fantasy, and the film is more like the space of actually like collaboration and like learning and discovering. So that's why I guess, for me, like I would love to even continue to bring them more into a dialogue with each other, but that was kind of where we were at after 2 years, because it takes time to learn, and I don't know, I'm not in a rush.
Well, kind of like it's a para work that is informing what we ended up doing with the opera. All of those different people, locations and stuff of the mind.
Yeah.
Question here.
Thank you. You talked about so many layers within the opera, which I haven't seen yet, and during the process also. So my question is about about the layeredness. I was wondering, what was part of this research? You mentioned Lachodrome. So what were other films or theater pieces or literature which were part of this research? And which pieces served as a negative example, so things to be avoided, and which pieces, by pieces I mean Carmen adaptations, but also maybe other things like Lachodrom, and which serves, on the other hand, as an inspiration of something to be followed, or more like like indirect inspiration.
Well, I can give you a little bibliography. There was everything from Carmen Jones to a film called Tar. Reading-wise, I certainly brought a lot of my own, I suppose, for example, like Dying Colonialism is a book that, and like Fanon, I was reading a lot of at the time. But those were all things that sort of were just present. But another really major one, which is how we sort of, I think, landed on the Spanish Civil War idea, is a book called Tomorrow, Perhaps the Future. And that's about various international journalists and artists and people who went to Spain to fight the international brigades or to cover it as journalists. And it was through reading that book, which came out last year, I think, that I started to sort of bring that as an option instead of keeping it in the 19th century, the archaeologist story. So that's another really important book, at least for me. And then from that, there was also that Peruvian film, no, the Chilean film. Yeah, something of the light. So it was like astronomy.
Nostalgia for the Light, that's true as well, was influential.
So that was a really major one. So we sort of knew that film is about people who lost family members to the junta in Chile, and then it's also talking to astronomers about searching for stars. So it's also this, that I think tonally was an important one, to have like the layer of really forensic searching alongside the layer of the cosmic searching, which is something that was like it's a difficult tone to hit. I don't know if we managed, but we were aiming for that. Those are the ones that come to mind for me. What about you?
Yeah, maybe the second part of his question was also like which negative examples, how to avoid it or what to do with it.
Yeah. No, you can.
Because I was like really deciding to say, as we were together in the research process, that there was like something really important about like accumulation and about like trying to see everything, and a lot of things to learn about the things that you shouldn't do, and you should avoid like almost everything that is done, because it's like so stereotypical in some way. It's like so reproducing this kind of inherent violence that there is a lot of like counter examples that are as important as all the examples. And when we're like thinking in this program, one of the ideas that we actually had, but we canceled that because it was not possible, was doing a marathon of like the whole Carmen's versions. And we started to think, and we had a list of like 100 or 150.
Literally hundreds.
And we stopped it like, no, this is because how you choose if like nothing is like really working in some way. I think that also the Patino's film, Basilio Martin Patino's film, was like really a main stone about like is this idea of like how the death is working in the myth of Carmen. And at the same time, I think that it was like really important, the musical research also on all the leaders that but there was an important like decision that I think that Wu made, and also in the conversations with Pedro, etc. That was about like there are a lot of like confusions that are like productive in the construction of the myth of Carmen or the construction of flamenco research. One kind of ground example is like this confusion between like the seguidilla flamenca and the seguidilla, for example, that actually has like nothing to do because something is like a Sevillana and something is like, but we were like trying to play with these kind of confusions as a kind of productive element. And actually in the performance that Maria Marin did yesterday, it was a kind of showing up all these productive confusions, letters, and trying to use that as it was used in the construction of the Carmen myth. So luckily we are not doing this marathon.
You could never. No, but I was going to say thank you so much, Pedro, for being here, because Pedro has been such a guide for me sharing so much resources and materials, such a deep knowledge of this subject. And the Carmen y Libertad film, which we will screen tomorrow, and Pedro will give his talk, but that film really exploded me, because I'll just tell you my take on it. It's because I've actually never seen the film with subtitles, so I'm really looking forward to that. I've only watched it in Spanish, and I have limited understanding. But what I understand is it's like a Swiss theater director goes to Sevilla to make a staging of Carmen, and he gets so obsessed about this topic, and at the same time he gets sick. So he ends up in a hospital. He has HIV, and he's in a Swiss hospital bed, and they have this proto-Zoom thing that they invented in the 80s for the storyline. It's a mockumentary, but basically they're communicating across this distance of telecommunication, and he just keeps, his idea for the play just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually they just fire him because they're like, we're sorry, your play is too, and I was somehow this is saying everything about my, because I literally did that journey. I went to Sevilla, I went on the Carmen tour, I had a manzanilla in the I just did all the things that are so cliche, but I actually loved that the film reflected back this kind of, in a very playful parody,
amazing 90s effects also.
Yeah, lots of, early CGI. It's just a fantastic film, so go see it tomorrow if you get a chance. But I really somehow I feel because all the tropes are set up, we're kind of set up to just not succeed. We will fail, and also we will not be complete. We will not achieve a comprehensive version or a program where all these things are addressed, but it's just so rich and layered that we just try. That's what's fun, I guess, about being an artist.
I think allowing for that, I just want to say, allowing for that messiness is actually maybe the way that Carmen doesn't die. So
there's a question here in the back.
Hey, I'm wondering if you could talk about how sound impacted your decision-making process for both the state, for the opera, and for the film, and what are the differences there?
Well, sound is very important. I'm not a musician, but I love to work with musicians, and I guess it is, it's another narrative layer. It's another way to tell the story. One of my favorite moments in our opera adaptation, that Andrew wrote this beautiful moment after the tarot scene when Carmen pulls the death card. She did this really simple thing where she rewrote l'amour to la mort. And so she sings in this minor kind of melody, a minor reprise of the habanera, but she's saying the death. And I really love, actually we had a lot of Zooms with Andrew and Enrique and others, and we're sharing some things about flamenco, actually the afterlife. She wrote this beautiful composition for the afterlife, which Sophia's text is sort of with, and this was an idea that we proposed about killing the melody by switching from minor to major, which is a very flamenco musical concept. So she did that with the end of the Bizet opera. She took the ending and she machoed it, she killed it. So, and then it's this ascending tone that it's very nerdy, classical music nerdy stuff, but it's also very beautiful. And I feel somehow it's embedded. If you, knowing these things, I feel you do feel there's a lot of intention there.
There is a beautiful sentence from Fred Moten again, when he says that sound brings back or return to us, I don't know exactly, the visuality that hegemonic ways of representation has lost or has keyed to us in some way. No? And I think that there was something about that, about trying to think through sound in a way. I want to tell an anecdote, if I can, because I was expecting if someone asked it that, because probably it could be you, because it was about the title of the video installation, that is La Gran Mentira de la Muerte. And can I tell it? It's something that I really like, because it's a sentence from Rocío Molina, that is a dancer of the film. We were having a conversation about like how she was kind of entangled or like repressed for all these like ways of normativities and violence through dance of a non-normative body, a non-normative idea of the understanding of flamenco, a non-normative uses of the technique, etc. And we were kind of having a conversation about the idea of death again. And everything was emerging about like how in flamenco the deaths like emerged like in the soleán, the seguirilla, and it speaks like itself. Nobody knows why, but it's like kind of like really associated in this way. But we were talking about like bullfighting actually, and we were talking about like this idea that during the bullfighting is the audience the one that kills the bull and not the killer in some way. That was something like really important for the understanding of the theater and how the opera should work in relationship with Carmen. And then she stopped in this way of walking that she had that is like really amazing, because she stopped like everything like the time with her, and she said like the only thing that I imbibe from the bullfighters is that they can die in the arena, because flamenco is a grand lie of the death in some way. And it was really a kind of motor also for understanding like the film in this way, and this idea of like how in flamenco also like the idea of death is all the time like being staged and in a kind of like a dramatical performativity that consists in extreme technical concert and then a strong interruption of like, in Spanish we use desconcierto, no? It's kind of understandable, no? In some way, this idea of like performativity that is kind of the rhetoric of flamenco was like really important for her, and her inner fighting was trying to reach a real idea of death actually in the scenery while she is dancing, trying to go like as deep as Carmen was in some way. So this is why she's like kind of like getting exhausted and reaching the limit, and there is like one kind of like medium possession time at the end that she just like falls, and the hair is on the whiskey, so it's really like a vanitas in some way, but was a really organic and natural of linked what we were thinking in all this research about like Carmen, and what we were thinking in the research about like how flamenco works in some way. So, la gran mentira de la muerte.
The film feels like a ritual to me.
Yeah, for
sure. Sophia, I was intrigued by what you said about the Mithraean idea that you slay the bull in order for the world to be born, and that sort of symbolism out of very ancient layers of our culture, and connecting it to Carmen. First of all, I was wondering how you would connect the two. I mean, I could see it. I mean, symbolically, you could, but you know, little bit elaboration on the one to the other, and which is intriguing also if you see the work of art on the other side, because there is a connection, of course. But how would you see that? And then you said something else which I thought was very intriguing. You said, well, if I look at it that way, I'm sort of I am at peace with the fact that she dies. If you look at it that way, sort of. But other ways, I would have liked to keep her alive, and that's also intriguing to me, because if you connect her to that sort of idea that a new world or the world is born out of it or something, and it's all symbolical anyway, so it didn't really happen. It's and you could also say, of course, that a lot of the symbolism in it is deeply troubling, you know, killing and blood, and but you could also say, well, whilst you're using it in a new way. So I'm wondering why you still want her to not be dying then. It's a difficult question maybe, but it's sort of intriguing symbolism, the one layer on the other.
Well, thank you for that question. I guess I will start with the second one. I I feel that this goes back to what Carmen represents for me in opposition to Don Jose. I never saw it as a love story. I saw it as a sort of two different points of view on a reality, not aligning, and one which is usually the one, the dominant one, the dominant paradigm is Don Jose. It's patriarchy, it's authoritarianism. He's a military man who tries to like go rogue, but fails at it. And through that shame, I mean, he's shame-driven as a character. Carmen famously has no shame. And like that, and then Carmen represents, for me, the many, many and ongoing revolutions. That's why, for example, we had this, one of my favorite things in the set design was a rock that had the word libertad. And somebody ran out of space, like graffitiing it, so there's no D on the end of it. And she is love, and she is liberty being, that everybody is equal, like the only way that she can be free is that like it's a level playing field. She's never going to be free, and none of us will ever be free until everybody is free, because if there's still a Don Jose present, or whatever, then there will be a force and an energy that doesn't want, that needs control in order to like have a role. And I think that undoing of that, I guess, is really like, I hope somehow answers that second question, but it also links to the first question about the Mithraic myth, but also the Mithraic mystery cult, because that was a space only for men, and usually military and merchants. So in a lot of ways, the sort of, I suppose, things like, Masons, or like the skulls at Yale, or like these sort of secret boys' clubs are the sort of offshoot of that. They are locations where power is created, and it's created through hazing, through, you began in the Mithraic cult as a Korax, which is a crow, and then you end up ascending through various rites, and usually those rites involve violence or tests of some kind, and it's a sort of generator in a way of colonialism, because they're all over the Roman Empire. You can still find them in every city. We have one in London. I mean, there I'm sure are in Andalusia. There even are in North Africa. So like that like sort of womb space, they were usually underground, and it's a very womby seeming architectural space, was only for men. And that's where they went to birth this sort of like hegemonic like power structure that they then exported everywhere, and continue to, I think, in many ways. So that I guess is like why an ancient ritual like the bullfights, I think, actually is really poetic, because one other thing I learned was that in ancient Greece, it was usually an old woman who had to kill the bull. And it's incredible that it still exists in any form at all. That's like a very ancient thing. But I do think if we revisit those ancient things, maybe we can create different and birth different versions of the world, hopefully not out of the blood of the martyred Carmen over and over again, but it might require a little, yeah.
If I can add something to that, because I really agree with what you were saying, and I think that is a really good question actually, because it's like pointing out when like the modern romantic project crashes with some ideas about like humanities and some ideas of ethics in some way, and there is a feeling of there is a necessity, as you were saying, Sophia, that about like keeping the order, like in this first question that you did about like how is the role play between like Don Jose and Carmen. Don Jose is a military structure and is the order of society, and And what is like shocking in the opera is that the moment of the death of Carmen has like a kind of like happy music. This is like really shocking the first time that you realize about that. And it's because it's a continuity of another that is not crushed in some way. But at the same time, there is a kind of like Lacanian guilty in this like slave and owner relationship, in this like kind of possessive and objectification of the body and the act of killing. No, so this guilty feeling about like trying to save Carmen has a lot of things to do about like a kind of guilty, hidden Lacanian feeling about like keep the things as they are sometimes. No? So it's like really paradoxical, but this is what it is in some ways. No, it's like this is what, in some ways, like the happy music tells to us that finally it's like yes. The only thing is that Don Jose already crashed it. No? His life already, but.
In a way, that jarring thing of like the happy music, I think is quite a important part of it, because it's hard not to notice that celebratory music at the end. Every time you're like, what? And if at least it does that to the average viewer or listener, I think it's, that is a useful thing. It's not parody, but it is oppositional setting.
Is there maybe a last question from somebody from the audience? Yeah. Okay. Go to you.
So you talked about, Sophia, about the revolutionary interpretation of Carmen. For you, it was more open-ended. What do you hope to reach in terms of reception among the audiences in the short-term future, in the audiences of your opera and or the film?
Yeah, that's a hard question, I think, because I think if you try to like know the answer to that, it kind of gets in the way of the process. But I don't know, like I do feel somehow just talking about the ending of Bizet, I'm like reminded that in the process of making this opera, I felt like I started to this happens to me a lot with big projects. Like I go in with I think I know what I want to say. I have like a clear critique or an agenda, and the more I work on the subject, the more I'm like, oh, he kind of knew some stuff. Like I think he was actually onto something. Like he was making also a mess. He was also problematic, but he was doing some interesting things. And I have like more respect now for the opera than I did. And I guess like trying to find this form, like this hybrid form where like we revived the dialogue, and like Sophia wrote all this amazing storyline, and it actually made me really appreciate the singing. Or like I think that's one of the things. I love opera, but like sometimes when I go to operas, I get really saturated by the like high plateau of like high musical virtuosity for hours, and it's just a little bit like I feel blown out by it. And that was actually something that I felt was like a discovery that wasn't necessarily my intention, but I actually really just love letting some of the moments where the singers sing, like I appreciate it because I have space to appreciate it. So I think it's like I'm always like open to like reviving or just finding life in something that I thought was dead. And that would maybe be something I would hope for an audience to also have an experience. I didn't even talk about the film, but...
It's very humbling also to see how well those scenes with the singers work when we've been like chugging away at adding stuff, and then just like some of them just float gorgeously. And yeah, I left humbled. That's what myself as an audience member experienced.
Yeah, Enrique mentioned the film by Patino that is screening tomorrow. There's an ending in that film where there's like a really intense montage of all these deaths of Carmen. It's just like an ongoing stabbing of all these singers getting stabbed. It's like super intense. I hope you see the film because I really was so stunned by that ending. And actually, I just tried to recreate that in ours. So we have like a triple death in ours where when Carmen is stabbed by Don Jose, like all three Carmens go down. And in our opera, yeah. So, I mean, that was literally me, just an homage to the Patino film, but literally just, somehow I feel like I've actually seen this opera so many times, and I actually, when the first time that we tried that in rehearsal, I did have a feeling where I was like, whoa, I'm like processing this death differently. Then I think it kind of, we get so used to it, like we don't, but I actually still, when I see it,
desensitized to death, relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, so it's like trying to process these things, I think. It's like really hard to do in the society we live in where everything's fast and everything's like all the time we think we know stuff, you know, but actually at any moment we have an opportunity to like reflect differently on what it is.
How many times do we watch the death before we stop it from happening? That's the open question for the night.
I think we're gonna stop it here because there's a bar. We can have drinks and chat further. Thank you for your attention, and thank you. Give all three speakers a big applause.